Hi, welcome to Scaling Up, the podcast that gets under the skin of business growth and strategy. I'm Jarrod Cairns, I'm a business consultant.
I'm Michelle Holloway. I am a HR consultant and leadership coach.
Hopefully, you saw our first podcast, so this is the follow on from that. And we thought, what better thing to do when we're talking about scaling up than to do a podcast about scaling up?
Yeah, why not? Exactly. Obviously, we know growth's exciting, but I think scaling's slightly different, isn't it, Jared? And I know we've got lots to share on that. I think, it's that whole don't run before you can walk kind of adage. So I think it's really important for businesses that are thinking about scaling to be, really thinking about systems, team structures that will kind of grow with them rather than, it kind of adding the complexity partway through and then ultimately breaking.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's a good point that difference between growth and scaling up. And um, the way I think of it is growth is about kind of what it says on the tin. It's about growth. It's about revenue growth. And you think growth, you just think revenue growth. But often, if you're only thinking about growth, that means sticking more bodies in. It means more cost being added to it. Whereas scale for me is all about growing your business sensibly without massively impacting your costs and adding to your costs as well. It's about, how you repeat the business you've got today and make that bigger as you go along without, growing that underlying cost base as well. And that can be done. Ideally, it's great, if you do it from the beginning of the business and you're thinking of scale when you set the business up, but you can do it at any point as well if you're thinking about, business expansion and the things we talked about in the first podcast is, where you are in that journey. You can start that scaling process at any point.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Interestingly, when you're talking about growth there and business size, I know a lot of people think about that size from like a turnover and revenue perspective. My head automatically goes to headcount, because I think
Mm.
of that as being quite reflective of, the size of someone's organization, how many people have they got, and then what does that mean from a kind of wage bill perspective as well. So
Yeah, yeah,
it's
yeah.
interesting thinking about it in that way because I guess there's the two sides to it, isn't there? And like ideally, when we're talking about scaling, as you said, Jared, it's that repeatable business format that doesn't necessarily mean lots more bodies, lots more headcount, and adding that wage bill because you want that scaling to ultimately be reflected in the revenue and the profit. And if you're just adding lots more people in there, then you won't have that same kind of income, side to the business. The profit won't sit there because it will ultimately be spent on your people costs.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Yeah, you're right. It's about increasing the output, isn't it? And the
Mhm.
performance
Yeah,
of people and looking at all of those efficiencies as well that can drive the business. And we'll talk about in a little bit. Rather than having lots of people running around like headless chickens trying to do 20 jobs. It's what
yeah,
how can you make that more efficient and future proof it as well as thinking about what does this look like today. And then if we get to point B, what does that look like tomorrow? And how can we improve the systems? We always talk, don't we, about people, processes, systems, and data, and all those things. When you're looking at scale, are really important. Is how you support your people in scaling your business, rather than just adding to your people. And as you said, then you're adding to your wage bill and to your costs, and that
hmm,
hits your margins and everything
yeah,
else.
yeah, yeah, definitely. So it's that structure piece, and I think your culture has to be ready to survive that scale as well. If you've grown your business on having a, a really kind of family feel to your business, kind of you want to keep some of that sort of feel and culture to drive, but ultimately adding more headcount, sometimes doesn't enable that. I also think, like you said, it's about growing smarter. So,
Mhm.
it's been really clear from day one where you can potentially replicate activity. So, like you said, that systems piece, how do you replicate? How do you think about things like AI? We know it's happening all the time in businesses now. Where can we streamline? Where can we use AI in a more efficient
Yeah.
way? So we're not necessarily adding to that headcount. But I think you're absolutely right. It's thinking about kind of consistency and clarity as you plan to grow.
Yeah, yeah, you touched on a word there about culture. And we talk about culture quite a lot, don't we? We've both got a sort of a focus on people, but it's setting that culture early, isn't it? In terms of
Mhm.
what does your business model look like? But what are your values as well going forward? How do you replicate your values to,
Yeah.
from a, if you're a small business and you've got that small family feel that you said in, it's about that value of family. Well, when you start to double, triple your size of the business, if that's your ambition, can you replicate that value
Yeah.
going
Yeah.
forward in terms of being that small business kind of mentality and approach to service? Does that still flow through in terms of what your scale looks like as well? And what about your workflows? You know, how do you process data? How do you process orders? How do you process deliveries? Those kind of things now that you look at now, and does that work? And again, I think when you're looking at scale, it's almost asking yourself, if I've got three times as many customers, will this process still work?
Yeah.
Does does it back itself up? And looking at systems and workflows and things like that, when you're looking at scale, it's like, do we need to invest now rather than at some point down the line, then trying to retrofit something usually costs you a lot more money.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. And that's interesting because I was just thinking that then I think, certainly small businesses, you may have that real personable touch early on, but if you as the founder or the business owner know that you want to scale and grow, you need to be thinking right at that beginning, even if you are just one person delivering a service, you can't kind of that culture piece is so important, but the system side of things, you can't
Mm.
start to bring in systems that just naturally take away that personal touch. So it's thinking about both those angles, from day one, really.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and I think it's the clarity, isn't it, as well,
Mm.
that everybody understands what that growth or what that scale looks like as well. And that goes back to the values, it goes back to the culture, and it goes back to the people piece again that we talked about a little bit in the first podcast. It's understanding that everybody needs to be on that journey with you and everybody understands their place in it. So for me, it starts with clarity. It starts with understanding roles and responsibilities, who does what and when. And when we talk about systems and workflows, it's easy just to think of electronics. It's easy to think of what my computer system, my CRM system, my order system, and all that. But actually, it's decision-making processes as well. Is how does
Mm.
decisions get made? And again, as you get bigger, does that process back up? Is it just two people shouting over the office, "Hey, we've got this order coming. What happens next?"
Yeah.
Is that going to work when your business is busy and you've got more customers and bigger orders or whatever that looks like? So again, those kind of questions need to be thought of as well. Is how do decisions get made and who makes them?
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And it's kind of two angles to that, isn't there? Because for me, is that how, if it's that one person and they're giving that kind of personal value and talking to their customer on a personal level, then how do you replicate that? So from a culture perspective, for example, that individual is the person that's got the relationship with the customer. And that's hard to think about, how do we do that? But it always starts with a conversation. So how that person converses with their customer base, their stakeholders, that's the culture side. But I think on the flip, you're absolutely right, thinking about that scalable behavior and how we set the tone for that. I always say to clients, have they got any objectives? Have we set any smart objectives? Do the employees know what's
Yeah.
expected? And often in small businesses, there's no process like that. There's not real clarity
Mm.
of where that job sits or what the delivery outputs are for that role. So, you do tend to kind of almost in hindsight say, well, we expected you to do X number of processes this month, for example. And I think that's the really important thing, that there's no measurables, there's nothing tangible in there.
Mm.
And to repeat and to scale, I think you need to be looking at, what are those numbers, what does good look like, what just ticks the box for success. I think, as we talked about before, too many people start businesses and then just employ someone as, you know kind of the auntie, brother, cousin, because they just say we need another person in the business, but they don't
Yeah.
really define what that another person is doing. I was speaking to someone yesterday, and I said, "Does that person line manage the individual you're talking about?" And they went, "Well, I don't know. That she's been here 12 years, she's been here 6 years." So I didn't really answer the question, but there was
Mm.
almost this small business mentality of, well, that person's been here longer, so they know more, and therefore they
Yeah.
are thought of as more senior. But there was nothing about structure, who's accountable, who's responsible. And I think without putting that in place very early on, you end up in this whole mess of, well, how do we then scale that? We've not set
Yeah.
that foundation really clearly. We've not actually defined roles. We've not set responsibilities. We've not said who does what and what success looks like and how we measure that. So I think it's really difficult then to then scale from that point.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and we was talking earlier on before we hit record, weren't we, about having contracts in place,
Yeah,
and again, small businesses, moving forward into the future, and at some point they're going to need handbooks, and they're going to need proper
yeah,
contracts of employment, and when somebody starts a new role, they need an induction process, and at some point, that's a great example. Someone's been, oh, they've been here 10 years, so they're obviously in charge, or without that definition of structure of, okay, when somebody starts the business, are we, we talk about repeatable processes. Are we always reinventing the wheel by, oh God, someone's starting on Monday, right? Well, we better do this, we better do that,
yeah,
rather than having a set process that says, okay, person starts, automated email goes out with the handbook, with a contract of employment, with all this. The induction process looks like this. They come in on day one, they bring the passport, etc., etc., and it's all set in stone, rather
yeah,
than this inefficiency of just making things up as almost on the spot as they go along. And to me, again, that difference between growth and scale is thinking ahead of time as to how would you build for replication? What does replication look like? What things are going to keep happening in your business that you need to be planning for now and putting, just putting processes in place.
yeah. I'm chuckling away because I know, like you say, we talked about it earlier, but it is the conversation I have time and time again with new clients, and as I work with people in the kind of SME space. They often don't have contracts or handbooks, and they
Mhm.
should, even if you've got one employee, they should have a contract of employment on day
Mhm.
one, if not before. They should be proving that they've got the right to work in the UK, all that kind of stuff. That stuff that feels very much, legalistic and compliance heavy and risk based. And yes, it is, but actually, it's the things that kind of set you up for success.
Yeah,
And I think, yeah, really important. I was talking to someone earlier this week as well about kind of setting your values system early on, so that you know what you stand for. Because when you think I'm recruiting my first employee, you want to attract someone who has the same value system as you, because ultimately you're
Mhm.
marketing your business. Your business is marketed to customers, but we don't market to candidates. We don't think we have to market to our employees, but we actually do, because if they are not on the same page as us, they don't have the same value system, they're not aligned to what we're trying to achieve as an organization, you're constantly going to really kind of struggle. So, don't just pick a lot of words out of thin air that you think are values, which I also see organizations doing. We are reliable, we
yeah,
care, all that kind of stuff. It's great if that's real, if that's really who you are. But, if you are a founder and you're just starting out, but you want to scale, sit down now, do that piece of work. Like, what really drives you? What's your North Star? What are your values? So that as you grow, you recruit people who are aligned to those values, and you also, in everything you do, you're sort of coming from that angle so that your business
yeah,
is scalable because you're applying those principles. I think if you don't do that, you kind of create a whole lot of mess because people are not on the same page as you. People are not working towards, a particular vision. They are just head down working in silo, and that just inevitably comes with, a kind of house of cards at a later date.
yeah, yeah. No, it's a really good point that, and going back to that almost retrofitting of things. If
Mm,
you're a couple of years into your journey, and then all of a sudden you start to talk about values and mission statements and contracts of employment or changing T's and C's, and then trying to lay that in, it does look like an exercise in, sticking a poster on a wall, doesn't it? Whereas if
yeah,
those things are in place right from the beginning, and you're right with that recruitment piece and that attraction piece, is if you're attracting the people who fit with your values and who buy into your mission statement, then that becomes part of the culture rather than
yeah,
trying to shoehorn it in, a couple of years
yeah,
down the line. Well, we're
yeah,
sticking this because it looks good, and here's a poster on the wall with our 10
yeah,
new values that no one really follows.
yeah,
Then, again, it can lead to conflict as well, can't it? Because then again, using the example we talked about before, you get people, why do we need a contract? Why
yeah,
do we need to follow these values? Why do we need to say and do certain things now? This isn't the way that we do it. So again, the earlier you can start the thought process and
yeah,
defining what that looks like from a cultural and I guess a working point of view, the
yeah,
easier it becomes then, and it just becomes part of your business, doesn't it? And
yeah,
everyone buys into it. And I think the other thing with that is when you're looking at a scaled plan. is allowing people to be part of it, particularly in a small business where everybody's involved, is
Yeah.
let people, there shouldn't be any surprises. If you let people know what you're planning to do over the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years, whatever that looks like, then again, they're bought into it. They can see what the future vision is of the business and how they fit into it, and how the values and the mission statements and all those sorts of things align to drive them to that point in time that the business want to get to.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. And I think we have to be honest, we said it earlier. When people do recruit to their business, they recruit people who kind of wear 10 hats, or they recruit a brother or an auntie or an uncle. So we're not being
Yeah.
unrealistic. We know that that happens. But yeah, everything you said is absolutely like kind of bang on into. Sorry, a cat has joined me. So sorry for anyone who's watching this. There's actually three of us
That's
on
some
this
valuable
podcast.
input.
He's probably got more valuable input than me. But yeah, you're right. I think, everything you said there, it's really hard when, you kind of, you're on your own, or you're sort of thinking, we don't know where we're going in the future. But the reality is, and hopefully this is, kind of the nature of this podcast and what people are getting from the value of this, is that you have to sort of start at the end and kind of work your way backwards. And I think,
Yeah.
we've talked about this before. You do recruit people. We've got to be realistic. You might need someone to come in and do a job and also do a bit of marketing and a bit of finance and a bit of something else. But you have to do that with the knowledge that at some point you intend to kind of have a bit of demarcation between those particular subject areas, and bring in specialists, or you might bring a freelance resource in for a while and then decide to kind of take that and recruit that as a permanent headcount. But I think we know at that beginning it's not necessarily anyone's focus. However, it's having the end goal in mind. If you think you are going to want to scale, create things now that will make that easy for you to
Hmm.
evolve into that, at the point at which that feels like the right time to tip the scales, and have that person, directly employed, or have someone who specializes just in finance, specializes just in marketing, whatever it might be.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Yeah. And looking at the processes again that sits behind it, and going back to the definition between the difference between growth and scale, and is that cost base, and that you're keeping that cost base under control, that you're replicating processes, and we're looking at repeatable systems and things like that that keep your cost base under control. And planning for the future. Well, what does that cost base look like from a logistics point of view? If you're buying in materials and things,
Mm.
as you grow your business, can you then start to leverage those relationships with your suppliers and get better terms and conditions from them, get better buy prices, so that increases your margin potential. And those kind of things. If you're shipping more, can you have conversations with your logistics people, and look at the rates that you're getting? So it's looking at all of those frameworks, and those internal frameworks that
Yeah, yeah,
drive that potential to scale. And again, what does that look like? So if you're looking to increase anything, the idea of scaling a business is obviously to grow your revenue as well, or to grow your margin. Is what does that look like in terms of your physical environment as well, and planning for that? What does that look like in a year's time, 2 years' time?
yeah,
And where does automation come in? It's a
yeah,
bit of a almost a dirty word these days, isn't it?
yeah, yeah,
Automation, AI. Where does that come into the conversation?
yeah. Yeah, definitely. I'm laughing because I was speaking to someone yesterday, a senior leader, and AI came up in conversation, and I said, what's the impact
Mm,
of that? And he said, I don't want to get rid of anyone. It's the last thing I want. I need, I've
yeah.
worked these heads into the budget, and I'm really clear that these are the right people, kind of deliver on this. But what I want them to do is realize that, from the perspective of AI and the automation and the tech we've got available to us,
Mm,
we need to streamline the way we work, because the only way we can absolutely scale is to automate as much as we can, so that we can use them for that decision making. We can use them to have that human touch, to have more
yeah.
conversations, to build those relationships with our clients and customers, which is absolutely what AI should be used for. We know that is a dirty word, because people think, well, that's just naturally people's jobs. But I think we have to be smart with it. We have to use it in,
Mm,
in the way that works for us. And business owners, missing a trick if they're not trying to automate things, but automate the right things. Don't just have it replace. There's no kind of replacement for that emotional intelligence and those conversations that are people first and people driven. I think it's it's looking at your whole, like you say, that ecosystem, all your processes, your tech, what can be automated, and where are we best playing
Mhm.
individuals in who can have the right kind of conversation. Who people who spot things, spot challenges, adapt, change. That's a kind of human driven trait, the kind of having that emotional forethought to think actually we need to
Mhm.
pivot or change something here. That's one of the things that AI, someone might challenge me on that, but hasn't quite caught up with yet. And I think that's where we use the automation and the tech to really drive
Yeah.
the stuff that can be driven through that, and that emotional human piece we keep the people.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, automation, AI, call it what you will. Um, it should add value to business, shouldn't it? It's not about replacing people.
100%.
Um, a repeatable process or a repeatable decision, it adds value, doesn't it? It adds scalability to the business. Keeping it really simplistic. If you've got three salespeople in a small business, and every order they're having to type out a quote, and then they're having to input an order onto a system, and they're having to send out an acknowledgement and all those kind of things. If you're then looking to grow your business, I think, well, actually, to make, to I don't know, X amount of pounds to it, I need another person to do that. Well, actually, no. If you can automate some of those
Yeah, yeah,
processes so that you're making your ordering self-serve for customers, or there's a process that goes straight into your system and straight into your warehouse and bypasses that salesperson, they can make another 10, 20 calls, they can manage another 10 customers. So you're still keeping your three salespeople,
yeah,
increasing their efficiency, increasing their time that they can actually do sales tasks, proper sales tasks rather than admin tasks. And you don't need a fourth person. So that to me is how
yeah.
you scale then. It's how you create efficiency that doesn't impact your cost base, but your profits and your revenues going up while your cost base is staying low.
Yeah, and you hope with those people as well that they get value from that part of their job, that interaction. I mean, some people absolutely are very process driven and their role is transactional and they want to keep it that way. But in a role like sales, for example, you would hope that they kind of get their energy from that enjoyment of having that
Mm.
conversation, and that's what lights them up because naturally extroverted, getting that kind of conversation flowing. So you play into their strengths as well. And I think it's important to do that, assessing where you can use automation. It might not be appropriate in some departments because
Mm.
some of those more transactional departments that might be where you do have that skill set of someone being very technical and having a real technical skill, and that's where their absolute skill set comes in. So to automate their work wouldn't make sense. Whereas,
Mm.
like I say, someone who's in a sales role, for example, or someone who's naturally in a people customer facing role, use all their stuff that they're doing that's very transactional, get that automated, because where they shine naturally and where they deliver for you is that face to face in contact.
Yeah, yeah, and having worked in sales and marketing pretty much all my career, salespeople hate admin. They don't want to do admin. They'll do anything
Exactly.
they can
Yeah.
possibly do to avoid. Or the other thing, well, they'll use admin as an excuse as to why they can't do more sales. So if
Yeah.
if you take that admin away
Yeah.
from them and automate that process, well, then you get into the nooks of a potentially of a problem. Is it a good salesperson or not? And you're freeing people up and you're taking
Yeah.
that problem away from them. So,
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
always in a sales environment, obviously, but it just shows how, efficient systems enable you to empower people to do the
Yeah.
jobs that they enjoy doing, and that their skill set is
100%.
nobody's particular skill set is around driving loads of admin and filling loads of forms in. It's people
No.
that you employ good people to do roles. Let them do that role and let
Yeah.
systems, data and automation and AI, let them do the,
Yeah.
the sort of admin roles if you can.
Yeah. Yeah. 100%. Brilliant. So how do you know when it's time to scale?
That's a good question, isn't it? How do you know when it's time to scale? I think for me, there's probably a couple of answers to this, but the first one is, if you've got a new business and you've kind of done all your research and you've proved the concept and you know that your product or your service is viable, is that's the best place to scale, because then you start and all the things we've just talked about is having things in place from day one, scalable processes and systems and values and people and all that kind of thing. But I think we work with a lot of businesses, don't we, that are already quite well into their journey. You say, oh, I want to grow. And I think that's the point there where you have to have that conversation. Are you set up for growth? Are you set up to scale?
Yeah.
And I think, that's the point where, when things like your culture, your leadership, your structure, your product set, the value that you're adding to your customer base can be scaled without it all falling apart and breaking if you've got consistent behaviors. Otherwise, to me, like, you put all that in place first, and then
Yeah.
then you look to scale.
Yeah, 100%. I couldn't agree more. I think from a people perspective, you need a culture and a leadership team that have got that capability. I think if you have one manager over here who goes rogue, one manager over here who follows process, a manager over here who's never read the disciplinary policy, a manager over here who lets people get away with murder, a manager over here who manages people to the
Hmm.
letter, you're just gonna break if you try and scale that. But if you've got a strong leadership team with a consistent message, everyone's kind of got the same values, you're working towards the
Yeah.
same thing. And as we talked about, you might have a manager with I don't know, a head count of 5 in their team. If you add a sixth person or a seventh person and take away some of that transactional activity, and you can build up that people capability for, whatever their role is, if it's sales, if they're customer facing, and you can scale in that way, but you've got a repeatable process of onboarding, recruiting, getting
Yeah.
people kind of lined up. What does that induction look like? What does the training look like? And that's all there already. And you are just repeating that formula. Obviously, I'd always say think about the individual. So some people learn differently, that induction, as much as it might be set, might be tweaked, but you've got something in place so that people can come in, understand the journey of the organization, understand where their role fits, all the different departments, and learns it however they learn it, because that's the bit that's niche to that individual.
Mm.
But ultimately it's repeatable, like you said, so you're not breaking it by adding another headcount in, because you've then got kind of disparate leaders doing different things, and there's not that consistency. So
Yeah.
that really
Yeah.
kind of stands out for me.
Yeah, definitely. And just while we're doing a bit of research for this sort of podcast, and there's a nice little line that's also made. So it's the point where adding volume add value, not chaos.
Yeah,
And I think that sums it up, because the one thing that's going to highlight problems in your organization and broken processes, or processes that aren't quite right, is when you start to scale and when you start to grow, and all of
yeah,
a sudden a few more orders coming in starts to creak, and people start to panic a little bit. And again, those
yeah,
people with 10 hats, they're not quite sure what hat to wear today. They're not sure who's accountable. Well, who's supposed to do that? And who's supposed to do that? Who's going to do that? And where does it lie? It's not my responsibility. And that's where
yeah,
those issues, because when
yeah,
something starts to go wrong, that's when everyone's responsibility starts to go. And well, it's not my responsibility.
yeah,
I'm not accountable for that. So having that in place early, it hopefully takes away that chaos when your business does start to scale, and
yeah,
everybody knows the place within the business, and all the processes are stress tested a little bit, so we're as sure as you can be. Quite often you can have the best process in the world, but until it's tested under pressure and under um, real day-to-day, what's the word I'm looking for? When stuff happens,
yeah,
basically. That's
yeah,
when you know whether your process works, doesn't it? You can put things in place, but until you
yeah,
start to test it, but it's best efforts, isn't it? And then you can
yeah,
tweak things as you go along, and that's where you can be ready, because then people are accountable. If you're
yeah,
accountable for a process, if it's not working, it's your responsibility to do something about it, or
yeah,
to bring the right people in, rather than it just falling apart, and then your
yeah,
business fails.
yeah, yeah. Which I think it's important then, thinking about it like that, to also think about delegation. That's a real challenge that I think as businesses grow in a leadership space, people really struggle to delegate. And
Mm.
then decisions bottleneck with, a founder, or, someone who's kind of been there from day one, who's always had that bit of the world and it's their world. They make the decisions, they have the conversation with the customer, they share that with the warehouse team, whatever that might be. There's that bottleneck there. So yeah, what do you think about that?
Yeah, no, I agree. Um, Again, working with a few small businesses, and worked in small businesses, throughout my career and along the way. I think you're right. Sometimes there is that, um, people hold on to it, don't they, as well? Well, two things happen. Either it's my baby and I'm going to look after it, and no one else is capable, or the staff think, well, I don't want to take responsibility, so I'm going to let him do it because he's the boss, he's the owner.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, to me, one of those two things that happen is people get a little bit too precious about, well, I'm the only person who can manage this, so I'll take it off, or actually, I'm just going to shoehorn this across the way because that's his
Yeah.
responsibility. And it goes back to that, what the common traits, if you like, of a scalable business is when those things are clear, the consistent, the
Mm,
culture's in the right place, the decisions, everyone knows who's responsible for decisions, who's
yeah.
accountable for it. Everyone's got the roles and responsibilities. And that doesn't mean to say that can't move around. 'Cause I think one of the other important points there is that things become teachable. So that
Yeah.
if you are a small business, you haven't got a lot of people. Well, I always use the what happens if you get knocked over by a bus,
Yeah.
analogy. And if one person is in, that shouldn't stop the business. It should be teachable so that, yes, it's your
Yeah.
responsibility, but if you're not in, person B picks up
Yeah.
that responsibility. But again, that's very clear and everybody knows that that's the process.
Yeah, I was going to say, and that it's that clarity piece again, isn't it? And I think that's where leadership comes in. And you do have those leaders who've maybe been with the organization from day one and very much keep that. That's my bit of the world. Or like you say, they kind of push that, and it's not clear who's responsible. I think if you are a leader in a small business, you need to have that kind of investment in you early on to understand, as the organization grows, what's your role as a leader? Where do you sit in that accountability space? Where do you delegate? How do you set very clear objectives, and so that people understand the expectation? How do you write job descriptions that really talk to what that individual is supposed to do? So not these kind of sort of high level, you might do a bit of this and a bit of that. Absolutely, there is you might be kind of backup for someone, but your role is
Mm.
predominantly X. And yeah, we know in a small business, you're going to have people with fingers in many pies. That's just the nature of it. But I think it's making sure that people are really clear. Your role is X and you are responsible for all these things. There may be times that you look at this, but without giving leaders that capability to have those conversations, I think again, you're kind of not setting them up for success as the organization grows.
Yeah, definitely. And it makes for a better place to work as well, doesn't it? It's,
Yeah.
if people understand their roles and the responsibilities and you're empowering people and you've got an ambitious business that's got a plan that you're part of, it's a much better place to work. We've all
Yeah.
probably at some point in our lives worked somewhere where it's utter chaos.
Yeah.
And that drives that, God, I don't want to go in today because what's going to go wrong? And then if
Yeah.
that goes wrong, then I'm going to have to pick up the pieces. If again, it goes back to cultures, doesn't it? And values. If you know that you're part of something, it's a much nicer place to work.
Yeah. Do you know, someone said to me the other day, we all think we don't want structure, but we do. And I thought,
Yeah.
it's so true. I think that's a kind of real human trait, isn't it? Like,
Yeah.
we might be happy working in the grey and but ultimately we want a bit of clarity, we want a bit of certainty about how things might grow. Yes, I think we have to accept small businesses that are growing, there's going to be those days where you come in with an absolute plan and it goes out the window. But I think having that clarity from day one, really thinking about what that environment looks like, what the ecosystem looks like, and then knowing that you can react. You've got a team that can react if they need to, but everyone's really clear
Yeah.
on what that looks like. I think it just makes it, a much easier transition to as you grow as a business because you've already set yourselves up for success.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. So I think, is I don't know, kind of a closing couple of messages really. I think scalability is, as we've talked about, isn't something that just happens.
No,
It's got to be thought about, hasn't it? It's got to be planned. It starts with the way that you build today, what your people look like, what your systems, your data, your processes, all the things we always talk about, and stress testing that almost as to what does that look like tomorrow and how can we make it efficient without overly impacting cost.
yeah. Yeah, definitely. I think that mindset of the leadership team to think we're always a few steps ahead, we're always thinking about the end goal so that we can work backwards from that. I think it's really important, rather than kind of reacting all the time, almost thinking where are we getting to? And then, having a mindset that's thinking 10 million turnover, even if you're only at two.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And as we said before, how can we get to that 10 without it creating chaos?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Thanks, Jarrod. Well, thanks everyone for joining us today on Scaling Up. Hopefully you've enjoyed this episode. Please subscribe, like, follow the channel, and we'll be back with more.
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. Look forward to speaking to you again soon.
Thanks, Jared. You too. Thank you.